Australian welfare state. He found that journalists frequently reported stories in terms of Australia's shame, questioning how such an intractable problem could enjoy in such a prosperous country. Further, McCallum's analysis of media coverage confirmed that the association between Indigenous Australians and violence and the structuring of stories around periodic crises contributed to public understanding of those issues as problematic. Both Bruff and McCallum's findings reinforced that media framing of Indigenous health and news media contributed to representing Indigenous health as a policy problem requiring radical policy action, but closer examination of the framing of Indigenous health in specific news texts was required to better understand the relationship. So the Northern Territory Emergency Response, otherwise referred to as the Intervention 2007, played out spectacularly in a collision of radical policy that led to the suspension of the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, one of Australia's most important laws for protecting human rights. Communities that boasted distinct ways of life as the oldest living culture in the world were suddenly referred to as prescribed areas, then towns, with individuals in need of reform. By and large, the media had a field day, fueling the fire with both reports and commentary that support that regime. The initial justification in 2007 for the intervention made by Indigenous Affairs Minister Mal Bruff was that pedophile rings were operating in Aboriginal communities. These allegations were refuted by the Australian Crime Commission in 2009, although after thorough investigation. However, many other serious social problems affecting Aboriginal communities, including alcohol-related harm, high rates of family violence and incarceration, were also put forward as justification for the draconian treatment of Indigenous peoples. Sadly, despite more than $2 billion being budgeted by the Commonwealth for the intervention and associated policies since 2007, many social problems facing communities have become worse. And I did a little calculation on that one today. So there's about 254,000 people that live in the Northern Territory. So let's assume that 200,000 of those are Indigenous. That's almost $1 million per person. If you were to actually cut that $2 billion up and give it to an Aboriginal person, and yet the disparities are worse than what they were prior to the intervention. So just from a dollar figure, you've got to go, what the hell is going on? Many of the social problems facing communities have become worse. Monitoring reports released by the Commonwealth tackling social indicators in prescribed communities document a massive increase in reported incidents of attempted suicide and self-harm in the opening 5 years of the intervention. The impact of the intervention has caused more harm than good, with a recent report stating the NT intervention has had the opposite effect on Indigenous NT people, noting many more Aboriginal children are being forcibly removed from their family and culture. Punitive measures have not increased school attendance. The intervention saw an increase in youth suicide and a huge spike in self-harm, which I've said 3 times because it's huge. The intervention housing program has a minimal impact on shocking rates of overcrowding. Income management has made life harder for many and remains racially discriminatory. The abolition of the community development employment, so CDEP, has created mass unemployment and exploitation. And just on that one, so the CDEP was a Commonwealth-funded program which gave people in these communities an opportunity to work. So that was actually pulled back. You have to wonder why. Restriction on courts considering Aboriginal culture, customs and law in bail and sentencing decisions continue. The number of Indigenous people in prison has exploded. We have a really high rate of children as young as 10 being incarcerated in our prisons. Discriminatory alcohol bans remain in force, and there is no evidence that they have reduced harmful drinking. I told you this was going to be a really depressing one, sorry. So what went so terribly wrong? Well, a further analysis of the NT intervention by Meskimen put what I consider to be the missing link, that being the importance of who gets to speak in constructing knowledge about Indigenous peoples controls the narrative. Meskimen described the official discourse, particularly by the government, overpowered those of Indigenous people living under the policy. That daily routines of news media and discursive practices of media-savvy social actors perceived as official or expert by media professionals formed a vicious cycle of two-way dependence, which is hard to break for potential sources with less official status, such as representatives of various Indigenous communities. What's not told, of course, is the impact that the manufactured narrative supporting the intervention had on the broader Indigenous population, and the reinforcement of stereotypes both attacking and taking away from already depleted sense of self, identity and spirit. For the sake of our conversation tonight, I investigated what 2021 and newspaper print are up to, focusing on a 2-week snapshot review of the Australian newspaper every day over a 14-day period. I found over 30 articles or mentions, which I found really surprising. The good news was that overwhelmingly the content was primarily focused on stories of self-determination and, interestingly, tourism. I think that's got to do with COVID and lockdown and all sorts of things. The one exception, a bozo having a rant about the new national curriculum and objecting to First Nations history being incorporated into the curriculum, arguing it could be covered in 2 sentences. Brilliance at its best. I chose not to dare to venture into the pages of other media publications. The acclaimed Australian architect Glenn Market often cites the wonderful ancient Aboriginal proverb when describing his approach to his architecture of touching the earth lightly. It's such a beautiful string of words that say so much. My only wish in the context of what we're discussing this evening is that a similar string of words of touching Indigenous spirit lightly and respectfully would pervade over the inclination of some media outlets to erode a culture of 60 to 100,000 years. A culture itself that is predicated on storytelling. After all, we are the first journalists of the world.
Thank you very much, Marie. It's very difficult to follow that, and particularly as a journalist. Let me say from the very get-go, there's an awful lot that journalism doesn't have to be proud of. It's a very difficult business that we're in. I'm here more primarily as a journalist than I am as an academic, although I'm treading into an interesting space at the moment, occupying both positions, I suppose, in a way. What we're going to talk about, what I want to talk about today was looking at the way in which newspapers generally have covered health in the past, and the kind of relationship that the media has to health information. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID, particularly the way that Australian newspapers and Australian media have covered COVID, because I think there is a very real difference. And it cuts to the core of the problem that we're faced with. Because when the media is serving two particular functions. One is a business function for its proprietors, for its owners. And when the media tends to cover for that purpose, it tends to work to its more base instincts. It tends to sensationalize, it tends to hype stuff up, which is the kind of thing that I think everyone in this room is aware of or has seen, particularly when it comes to medical stories, health stories. So, a US study of 9 large US papers looking at the coverage of neurological illness in 2006 found a few interesting things. They found that medical errors or exaggerations in 20% of the samples of stories. They found that stigmatizing language in 21% of the samples, and articles reporting on certain conditions such as epilepsy, migraines, were more likely to contain stigmatizing language. And this is because, as I said, we've seen news organisations, news journalists hyping up the sensational, because we know that that tends to create audiences, grab attention. There was also no correlation between the disease prevalence and the frequency of news coverage. Now, again, I don't think this will come as any great surprise to anyone here in the audience. There was a CDC survey, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention survey, found respondents used newspapers and magazines more than any other media sources of family, friends, physicians, and nurses combined. Now, this was a pre-COVID survey, and the results more recently show a slightly different trend. But it's worth pointing out, because whatever we say about the media, the coverage the media delivers actually has a profound impact on public understanding of health. Individuals without first-hand knowledge of health issues learn and make inferences from the media. Again, it might be stated as bleeding obvious, but it is worth placing in the front of our minds in the context of this conversation. Media medicine. A few members of the news, this is a statement again, a survey from the CDC that asked journalists and scientists about whether they agreed with these statements. The first one, few members of news media understand science. Well, no surprise there. 91% of scientists agree with that statement. 77% of journalists also happen to agree with that, which I think is quite enlightening and disturbing. News reporters are ignorant of the process of science, 69% to 46%. News reporters cannot interpret results, again, 66 to 48. News reporters overblow the risks, 61 to 45. News reporters rarely get the details right. Guess what? Journalists agree with that 62% of the time to 56% of scientists. You guys can go through all of this, but one of the interesting things I think here is this particular one here. News reporters focus on personalities and not findings. For scientists, this is going to be seen as a problem. Scientists agree with that statement 49% of the time, but journalists agree with it 70% of the time. And that's because journalists tend to use personalities as a way of articulating stories, as a way of communicating, particularly with health stories. Now, that's bad when it comes to the kind of data-driven science that medicine is so typically involved with. But it's the way in which journalists tend to convey information in a way that people identify with. And finally, news reporters want instant answers. Again, 75% to 52. I'm not going to go through, I'm not going into too many examples, but just this one, Deb cited a few brilliant examples. This doesn't come close. The cancer doctors cite risks of drinking alcohol. The New York Times story. The American Society of Clinical Oncology, which represents many of the nation's top cancer doctors, is calling attention to the ties between alcohol and cancer. In a statement in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the group cites evidence that even light drinking can slightly raise the risk of a woman's risk of breast cancer. Now again, Deb will tear all sorts of massive holes in that one, all sorts of fallacies and false assumptions. You guys have far more experience with this than I do, but again, we can see that this is the kind of reporting that even creeps into the New York Times. Let's have a look at COVID coverage, because this is different, because particularly in Australia, what we see is the way in which journalists, I think, shifted their focus from simply selling papers to an understanding that they had a social responsibility not to their proprietors, but to their readers and audiences. Let's go through and look at the saturation coverage. Prime Minister Scott Morrison usually appears in 5% of stories. Bushfire season was mentioned at the height of the 2019 and 2020 season was mentioned in 30% of stories. In the height of the COVID crisis, it was mentioned in over 80% of stories of some days. An absolutely extraordinary saturation coverage. University of Canberra News and Media Research Centre found most Australians are concerned, or very concerned, 60%, not a massive surprise. Of those who say they're concerned, 78% said that their news consumption had increased. Half of Australians are using TV as their main source of COVID news, which is actually an increase on previous years. Think about what this means. Television is driving the conversation, it's driving the agenda. The most trusted experts are science and health experts, 85%. Again, what you would hope and expect. The government, 66%, and news organisations, 52%. Now that figure does look very low, but believe me, it is higher than news organisations typically get. Trusted news about COVID is higher. 44% trusted Australians trusted news in 2019, and now 53% trust news. This is because of the way that news organisations have covered COVID. They've done it with responsibility. I would argue, and I know every one of you, I'm sure, can and probably is thinking of examples that you will have seen in coverage in recent years, in the past 12 months rather, that say, journalists are talking rubbish, if Peter's talking rubbish, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But I'd submit that part of the reason that Australia in particular has some of the lowest infection rates anywhere in the world is because actually the system has done a reasonably good job. It's done what it's supposed to do. The government has introduced policy. There has been rigorous and robust debate based on pretty solid, accurate information in the media. And the government has screwed up. There has been criticism in the media, and it has been correcting. It has acted as corrective to the system. It is imperfect, I understand this. And there will be examples that you will all come up with. I know this. But the results, I think, speak for themselves. I'm not going to point too much here. Misinformation has mostly come from social media, which is really where the vast extent of the problem is. I think we'll leave it here. The one thing I was going to finish on was to talk a little bit about the way that a more subtle problem related to the media and its coverage, and the way that the political coverage, and the way that the media has largely uncritically adopted the language of war and conflict. I feel very strongly about this, particularly with regard to the war on terror. I think it has created a terrible problem because it's forced us to think in terms of the military response or a militarized response to a crisis, which is not and need not be that. Trump said we are viewed as a wartime president. I mean, that's what we're fighting. Scott Morrison, we are all in a war against this virus and all Australians are enlisted to do the right thing. But the rhetoric of the war on terror alienates and divides people in groups. It creates an us versus them mentality. It avoids accountability for change. It transforms the disease into a security problem and not a health problem, not a medical problem. It smothers criticism as unpatriotic. It limits our options for dealing with the pandemic, and finally, it increases that language of conflict and fear. And this is not necessarily the right way to deal with it. Now, this has been a constant failure of the media. It's been a constant political failure. And I think it is one of the things that we really need to be discussing when it comes to this issue. Thanks very much.
Well, to those two addresses, I really don't know what I can contribute other than to, I guess, talk about how we got to this point, and maybe then point forward to what we might come to expect in the future. And I'll give some practical examples, and I'll draw on what Peter and Maria talked about. Firstly, you might think that a health reporter or a health editor should have some sort of medical training. It's rare, completely rare. Norman Swan is an exception to the rule. I came to journalism first as an 18-year-old from Inverell. I knew very little about Inverell, let alone the world. I learned pretty much in the Courier Mail newsroom to write a very formulaic type of article on whether it's crime or courts or whatever. And my first stint as a health reporter was not something I considered. It was a promotion, though. It was seen as an important issue. It was a very emotive issue, one that our readers were invested in. And so that was my path into health reporting. There was no specialist training. I made sure to buy a big, thick textbook on medical terms that I leafed through every day. There were some photos I would avoid, and they would always catch me out. And I wondered what I was really covering in the end. But I learned very quickly that it's a fascinating, incredibly important, and an incredibly difficult area for a journalist to cover. And like Peter said, or further, there are good journalists, there are bad journalists, there's good media, bad media. There's a lot of variance across the board, and some health reporters do the job very well, some could do it better, and some people who write about health but aren't health reporters can go either way as well. In terms of what we face as health reporters and health editors, as I said, it's a very emotive issue, and you can write about something as simple as the flu, and maybe you will say, well, it's another bad flu season or something like that. The person who hasn't had influenza will regard that article completely differently to someone who's struggling with it right now. Now, how you write in such a way as to present the same information to all people can be incredibly difficult. Marie talked about issues of closing the gap and access and affordability. It's all very well to talk about the great new treatment that's come on board, but that's no help to the communities who don't have a doctor or who had to drive 3 hours to get to a hospital. And again, how do you write and report in such a way that you're getting that message across to your audience? A lot of it depends on your sources and getting to know your sources and the lay of the land. One of the first articles I wrote as a health reporter at the Courier Mail, a very respected, I'll anonymise him a little bit, specialist in Brisbane called the editor and said that they've just got this wonderful new piece of equipment, the only piece of equipment of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. This is massive news, and we agree. I did a little bit of research, and I learned that this piece of equipment was incredibly important. And we put on the front page that so-and-so at such and such hospital had this piece of equipment, first of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. And that day, I probably had 10 phone calls from specialists around Australia who have had the very same piece of equipment. Now, I, like a lot of people, have grown up to think we implicitly trust doctors. But doctors are the same as all of us. They might have a bias, they might have a prejudice, they might have motives, and they might just be a little bit lax with the details, which I think this case was. So you have to, I guess, deal with different groups and different people that see things differently. There's this access and affordability issue for patients, but that also goes, I guess, to the broader policy debate. It's those who have the resources and the money and the loudest voices tend to get heard. Those who don't tend to struggle. Now, how you address that, I don't know. Any campaign needs to build support somehow, whether it's a good campaign or a bad campaign. It needs to build support to get attention, to get governments and authorities to act. Unfortunately, in health, some people have more resources than others. When I became health editor of The Australian, when I came back into the round, the first congratulations I had was a phone call from the Philip Morris tobacco lobbyist. And I was a bit confused, thinking, health editor, you know, this is unusual. And he just wanted to let it be known that he was available should I want to write anything about tobacco policy and tobacco control. And then I got an email from the Brewers Association, the very same thing. They're available should we want to write anything. You know, because some people write things that, you know, drinking is bad and causes cancer, and smoking causes cancer. Now, they have the resources to go to that effort because they just want the journalists to just have an inkling of doubt in the back of their mind. You know, when they go to write something, that inkling of doubt is worth a lot of money, you know, the cost of employing a lobbyist. Now, the cancer groups or the tobacco control groups, they have got better resourced over the years. But if you see it as a sort of balancing act, it can be difficult to be the journalist in the middle of it, even though we know exactly what's going on, and you still report without fear or favour. Then you have the politicians. And I wasn't health editor when the intervention was happening, but I was health editor when the Australian wrote a series of front page articles that didn't come from the health editor. It came from somewhere else about a syphilis outbreak in Aboriginal communities. The tone of those articles was, here we are again, child abuse is rampant, syphilis is being spread by child abuse in all these communities. It wasn't. Syphilis was spreading, but the cause of it was issues with hygiene and lack of health service. So I pushed back against that. Others pushed back against that as well. But by the time the fire was lit and certain conservative politicians got on board, again it became a sort of paternalistic thing that we have to do something about it. You know, they can't look after themselves. This is another example of intervention. That became quite an issue for about a month within a newsroom, with certain people pushing one way and certain people pushing the other. Again, the facts would suggest one thing, but how it's portrayed or how it's interpreted suggests something else. And that can be really difficult. Actually, before I talk about facts, another thing that Maria reminded me of as well was there were some articles, again, I think they it started with a conservative politician a couple of years ago, went to Talkback Radio, and then it became my job to write about it. And it was about a change to the nursing code, if I remember correctly, that needed to recognize that nurses, how it was portrayed that nurses must basically couldn't enter a room with an Indigenous patient without recognising their white privilege, and how this would stop. It was a ridiculous portrayal to start with, and when I was asked to write an article on it, I thought, okay, well, you know, sure, that's what's being said. Let me just have a look at the code. And I know a bit about cultural safety and those sort of aspects. Let's have a look at the code. It wasn't even in the code. It wasn't even in the document. It wasn't even in the references. One of the references pointed to another report where it was one line in that report. And so all the work that was being done in that nursing code got blown out of the water by talkback conservative politicians saying, oh my God, they expect, you know, nurses to, you know those sort of talkback propagated stories. And a few months after that, the nursing code got another bash because, to be fair, they tried to merge the nursing code and the midwifery code. And they ended up, it was something to do with pronouns, because they couldn't say she when they tried to bring uniform. But of course, then the same politicians and the same sort of outspoken activists got up and down about this culture wars agenda. So you have this environment that happens out there in the community where people have different views about the same thing. It also happens inside newsrooms. Some newsrooms are established, but they all go through phases. I think the Australian has become made of reports a bit better at these things since I left. There's no connection there. It's just a coincidence. Other people left at the same time. But you have that sort of environment, and also going back to that same thing where patients see things differently, readers see things differently, and there's that sort of push and pull in trying to report about what are really important, serious, emotive health issues. Then it comes to the details of health reporting. I won't recap on every possible thing that causes cancer. I will catch cancer right here because microphones are probably carcinogenic as well. You can push anything to say that you will catch cancer. And people love to read those stories, and that's the other difficult thing. Sometimes you can seek out an article and you can do a great job in reporting it factually and fairly. Sometimes an article is brought to you because it's already done the rounds of social media that morning and it's going off. And you have to then write something, and when you take it to your editor and you say, no, the risk of cancer is actually quite small and quite isolated, it can be a difficult conversation. Sometimes the mere process of putting something down on paper can have huge ramifications for people who are reading health stories. A few years ago, you might remember we had the doctor death case in Queensland of Jane Patel, a surgeon whose methods were called into question, and there were inquiries and investigations and charges and so on. The media wrote that Dr. Patel was linked to the deaths of 112 patients. He wasn't linked to the deaths of 112 patients. The journalist read a document that had, where are his former patients now? 112 have died. It's no surprise that if you're seeing a doctor, if you're in surgery, you might have some serious health issues, and with the passage of time, you might die. So this was inflammatory. 112 people. He's linked to the deaths of 112 people. I thought I'd write it responsible. I said he's only linked to the deaths of 12 people. And that word only. Who am I to say that it's only 12 deaths? And I didn't pick up on it. No one else picked up on it until it was in the paper. And I had my first phone call, and I thought, shit, yeah, of course, awful. So there are those sort of difficulties you deal with. You have very well resourced, as I said, and very active campaigns on things as seemingly technical as pharmaceutical benefit scheme evaluations of whether drugs should get subsidies. You probably all read the stories about Joe Blow, who has this illness and has to pay $500 for this drug, and it's an outrage. What you might not know is probably a couple of days before that, the PR company that's acting for the pharmaceutical company will send out an email that has, here's some case studies, here's all the background, here's all the quotes, here's what we say about this drug. It's going to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee next Monday. So people will write these articles. That builds pressure, political pressure, pressure on the officials to then subsidise those drugs. All this is happening behind the scenes. PR, I'm not sure, but I think there are now more PR people in Australia than there are journalists. And it got to a point at The Australian where I'd no longer answer my phone. I set up a new email address for all the PR to try and get it out of my inbox. And then I wouldn't answer my phone because every PR person who sends you something that they're pushing, for whatever reason, for whatever commercial benefit, would then ring to make sure you got the email. And then they'd ring a day later just to see whether you thought any differently of it. So in the middle of this, you got the young guy from Inverell still trying to work out why he became a journalist. So the pandemic, Peter touched on the pandemic. I think it's been really interesting broadly speaking, how receptive Australians have been to being told to do something. When it started, I thought this will be fun. This will be really interesting. Let's see if we can tell Australians to wear a mask. Oh, no. People, by and large, have been quite accepting of that. Again, there have been terminology issues along the way that do complicate things. Border closures. There's no way to open the border, let alone close it. But we immediately said, border's going to be closed. I think Anastasia Palaszczuk tweeted the first time it was going to be closed, and it set the pigeons race. How people do things, the AstraZeneca blood clot issue was a late night, well, not a late night press conference, a nighttime press conference. I knew it was significant, so we weren't publishing at that time, but I was tweeting about it on that lovely place called Twitter. And then only later did I think, well, what impact is this having on vaccine hesitancy and confidence in the process? The mere fact that I've dedicated maybe 5 tweets to a press conference that's happened at night gives the impressions that, oh no, we should be wary of maybe all vaccines. Greg Hunt this week got himself in trouble when he appeared to say that, oh, if you're worried about this particular vaccine, don't worry, we've got some others coming, which then put a cloud over that vaccine. I was to hazard a guess, he is trying to second guess himself and respond to questions that haven't even been asked, and you get wrapped up in that whole thing. We have social media at the same time going nuts. It is the rise of tribalism, sort of segmentation of the community really worries me. That I take a long time to make up my mind on most issues. Some people will just make up their mind based on who they follow, whether it's a politician or it's a realtor. And so where does this lead us to in the future? Newsrooms are becoming poorer, less well-resourced. The people who have the resources, the lobby groups and the companies, are becoming stronger and more powerful and influential. We may get to a stage where the health advocates need to become activists just to be heard. And hopefully the way that the media is sort of changing and transforming. We already had The Conversation as a good website, which gives a little bit more sort of nuanced, detailed information on a variety of things, including health. I think we will see some more segmentation, see some media take some issues more seriously than others. It remains to be seen. It's still an incredibly important, sensitive, emotive issue. I wish we'd made more progress on things like closing the gap. I think that's one great example of how you can pour a lot of money and a lot of attention at something and do a lot of articles seemingly on something and not get anywhere at all, which is a tragedy. But again, hopefully that changes. Some of the young people coming through, I was talking to Deb earlier, are a lot more engaged and passionate about issues. So if we are leaving it to this fight of ideas and activists, hopefully they can lead the way. But I think we're now opening up to questions, so I'll shush.
Thanks to all our speakers. Sorry, thanks to and also, okay, all right. So this, by the way, is Claudio Mazzola. So he's actually, thank you so much for all the speakers for all the effort put into those fine presentations. This man has done so much heavy lifting. He deserves to be acknowledged for it. You don't know what goes in on behind the scenes of organising something like this. You know, the risk assessments, the security applications, and then organising events. So yeah, Thank you. Okay, so questions?
I was hoping someone else would first, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I'm here. I'm an emergency physician who's currently dabbling in clinical ethics, so that's why I'm here. And I really enjoyed all your talks, and they all struck a chord for different reasons. I think perhaps one view that needs maybe has a role, should be heard in this is the impact of media stories on clinicians who are providing the care at the front line. And I was just reflecting as each of you spoke actually that some of the darkest, but some of the hardest times that I've had practicing emergency medicine in various places, including the Northern Territory for 5 years, have been when I've felt that the media is portraying doctors as one type of person. And I felt that in the Northern Territory when I was there during the time of the intervention, and felt like doctors in some way were by some aspect, parts of the media portrayed as complicit with some of the decisions that have been made. And similarly, I felt it when I work at the Children's Hospital, and when the previously called Leeds Children's Hospital was open here, we really felt like we were that someone in the media had declared war on us, and most of us, get out of bed in the morning to try and do our best. And for about a year there, and I will say it, the Courier Mail didn't seem to want to recognise that, and it was really hard. And you talk about tea rooms in newsrooms. The tea room, the moral distress in the tea rooms in the certainly in the emergency department where I work was really palpable. And so I don't think there's any easy answer, except that I think what we need across the board is much more nuanced portrayal of things that are really, I think the challenge that you've all alluded to is that health matters are, not black and white mostly. They affect people at their most vulnerable time, and it's really hard to convey that in the media at any level, I think. But I think the more nuance that we get and the more independent perspective, the better it is. And I guess just because it has an impact not just on patients, but on those of us at the bedside. But thank you very much.
Just to, you've reminded me of one incredibly important factor that you'll be aware of, but most viewers wouldn't see it. Doctor-patient confidentiality means that often there'll be something that blows up and you can't say anything about it. If you're a good doctor, you won't talk to a journalist. So you have these cases that emerge where you're effectively a sitting duck, putting aside, a policy debate about the size of the children's hospital or the name of the children's hospital. Something will rise up where some journalists won't even endeavour to attempt to find the other side because they'll go to the usual spokespeople who say we can't comment. Two quick cases of where that happened. Again, in the Patel case, it was a front page photo of this poor chap holding up an X-ray, had a bent needle in his stomach, and the headline was, Patel told me it was all in my head. That was shocking, and that affects confidence in doctors, confidence in the hospital system, overseas trained doctors. I had good relationships with doctors at that time, and someone pointed out to me that the needle was bent. This poor chap had Munchausen's. He swallowed the needle. As he'd done many times, he apparently had a file that was an inch thick, and quite possibly Patel told him that he had a mental health issue. But it was portrayed in the paper that, oh, for God's sake, the hospital's so bad they're leaving bent needles in people. Second one was the coalition up here ran a particularly powerful election campaign ad once with a woman saying, my brother died of this disease, now I've got it, and they won't give me my operation. Do I have to die too? Hugely powerful. The next day, the day after it aired, her daughter rang and said, I'm so frustrated, they won't give mum the operation because her and Auntie Sue are up every night drinking and smoking, and they're worried that you know, she'll have an adverse event unless she cuts that out. But again, that side never came out. And I don't know how you address those issues. I think people need to not be embedded in communities, but have a better understanding of what it's like to be a doctor or a particular specialist or whatever, and have an understanding of how that works in practice to really prepare themselves for those stories that arise. But I agree, you're quite often, yeah, you don't have a voice. And it affects confidence. I know I've gone to public hospital emergency departments myself and thought, here we go, this will be fun. Straight through. Sing, it's fine. Some nights it's a bit of drama, but you become to expect what you read about it. And yeah. I have no answer to that at all, other than to confirm.
Right, well, thank you for your presentation. My name is Andrew, I'm the Clinical Ethics Coordinator for Metro South. One thing that I've been looking at lately is the potential impact of artificial intelligence and potentially deep learning algorithms at the bedside and how they might exert some sort of influence in patient relationship. Everyone's sort of touched at the moment how health media can erode public trust, might reinforce some sort of bias, might reinforce some sort of prejudice. So there's a particular technique that's used in deep learning called natural language processing. And so it's not only humans now that are reading health media, so it's also an algorithm that can read the media. Obviously, it's not going to engage in the same way, engage in the same critical thinking as a human might. But research is now showing that through the use of natural language processing, that algorithms are becoming encoded with the same bias that are read through into the documentation, into the text. So I was wondering what the implications are for media in terms of responsibility when it comes to reporting, if we're not potentially only eroding trust or promoting bias, but we could now also be encoding.
I don't need to say anything. Can I just confirm what it is that you're concerned about? Because I'm a little bit confused. You're talking about sort of algorithmic learning?
Sure. So it's research is fairly strongly suggesting that the algorithms that are used to learn more or less, or to create clinical decision-making support systems are being encoded with biases from.
Make no mistake, they are biased. I mean, the algorithms are coded by human beings, and those human beings are bringing their biases into the system, and there are fairly well-documented examples of facial recognition, which is very good at identifying Caucasians, lousy at identifying Indigenous people, people of colour. That's because the system was created by white people for themselves, and there's nothing particularly sinister in there. It's just that that's the way the system works. We know that they've encoded things like sexism into it. Again, this is because of the parameters that the engineers initially programmed those algorithms to work with. And so, yes, they are biased, and they will become increasingly biased. My thing, this perhaps also comes back to what you were saying earlier as well, Matt, that I think what we have to do, what we're doing at the moment, this is a bit of a rant of mine, so forgive me, tell me to stop if I'm going too strong. But I think what's happened is that they've allowed our media ecosystem to be driven by the engineers who are serving their companies in Silicon Valley. And they've done it very well. This isn't a criticism of them. They've done their job extraordinarily well. But what's happened is that the algorithms, social media, and the media environment has come to dominate to the point that it now counts as a utility. It's a part of the infrastructure of our country. It makes no sense that we should allow our infrastructure to be engineered to serve business people, the investors in Silicon Valley. I think what we need to be saying is we're recognizing first that these are engineered devices and demand that they be re-engineered to serve us. in a way, and so we have algorithms that don't prioritize information to command our attention or to reinforce biases, but that are coded to prioritize good information, prioritize good journalism, prioritize those people that produce good work and good intelligent analysis. I think that is possible. It just requires the political will, but it also requires a public debate. I am not saying this to absolve journalists of the responsibility of the kinds of failures that we've been talking about. But I do think that the incentives at the moment are driving speed over accuracy, polemic over serious analysis. And this does not help a good information ecosystem. So if we can change it, reconfigure it to prioritize the reverse, prioritize accuracy, balance, fairness, sober analysis, good solid reporting, then I think we will be in a much better system. We need to understand the way that that infrastructure works and influences the way that the media operates.
I would say something in that as well. I think, yeah, it's definitely a very good point. It might also be, it might suggest a way that we might have to limit the power of an algorithm, because some of the deep learning mechanisms now, they mimic the human brain in the way that they function. And so even the person who develops the algorithm can have a misunderstanding of how it reaches a certain output, because it runs through so many hidden layers, hidden nodes. It can actually start to learn by itself. And so like a primary example of that is the Google DeepMind algorithm that won in Go in Korea in 2015. So that algorithm started producing moves that had never been seen in the 2,500-year history of the game. The developers didn't do that. The machine learned that. They don't know how it did it, and they don't know how it came to that output. So I completely agree that they're engineered, but I think with the way that it's going, there's potentially something that lose control of how they can understand what the algorithm is doing. So I think you make a good point that might point to the constraints of an algorithm's capability.
Nice and clean now. Yeah, my name's Phil, I've been a mental health nurse for a long time.
I'm sorry, keep going.
I'm just thinking that I know some clinicians who I class as sociopaths, verging on psychopaths. I imagine it's the same in the upper echelons of the media industry and in the newsrooms. And I'm just wondering how much of an influence these malign characters actually create and what can be done about that. And I sort of put this machine learning in that same category, that once these characters are their programming the AI, it becomes very hard to control.
That's a loaded question. Yeah. I mean, you can kill them. That raises different sort of ethical issues. No, newsrooms are very vibrant places. There are all sorts of personalities, and everyone comes at it from a different point of view. Some are particularly outspoken. Thankfully, they tend to migrate to become columnists. And it's helpful when they're columnists because then they're a little bit quarantined and you can kind of push them over to one side. You can pull that page out of the paper if you've grown to expect that they're particularly nuts. I think it's an issue with society generally. You know, you go on Facebook, the loudest, angriest voice is always out there, and there's always someone who's willing to respond, and it just becomes this sort of echo chamber or this ever-decreasing circle. I don't know what you can do about machine learning. Every topic can be interpreted 1,000 different ways. Every word or every issue, you say something like cancer, to someone it will shock them, and to someone they might be, complacent about. I don't know, I think this is a broader society issue of how we kind of rebalance things so the loudest destructive voices don't get all the attention.
Just going back to your anecdote before about the nursing code and how someone had dug into a reference, cited in a reference, and found something. I mean, clearly that's a misuse of their opportunities to educate and inform.
Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of the category I'm thinking of.
I think I can talk for hours about where I think things went wrong. I think the media misjudged and kind of misplaced itself when the internet came along. I think we looked to social media for too many clues and cues for how to do things. The idea that people want to see conflict and they want to see a dispute, or saying to someone earlier that they really want to click here and see the video of someone being bashed up. I don't, but I think some parts of the media have sort of taken all those sensationalist clickbait cues and they've gone down that path. I hope, and I think it will come back to a more moderate, community-minded, sensible centre. But I think we're in an interesting stage.
I just wonder how much we can blame the owner of the Australian for all
As a former employee of News Corp, I can say things. No. Look, News Corp has a lot of good journalists. Some parts of the organisation let the politics get in the way and they just instinctively lurch to the right, which I don't think even serves the right any great favours. You know, if you're a Liberal Party supporter, do you just want to hear all the time that the Liberal Party's great, or do you want to, get the good with the bad? But I think the media is going through a bit of a transformation, and there's a lot of us hoping that new things will, new ways and new methods and new audiences and new platforms will develop, and somehow we'll see some sort of green shoots and change.
Marie, do you want to say something about that? Oh, yeah, I think, we all have our own responsibility to actually reflect on what we're seeing and hearing as well. I mean, we all blindly take information that we read without questioning it, and some of the information that you see, it's wrong. I mean, have a look at Trump and what he was able to spin, but we blindly take that on. So I guess I'm flipping it back a little bit to the individual and how we need to practice self-reflection and analyse things and question as well. And I think of the example of 500 medical students sitting in front of me who have these misconceptions about who we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and they're guarded and they're like, oh, you're going to tell me stuff that I don't want to hear because they're so conditioned. But you give them the information and the evidence, and suddenly their eyes are open and they want to know more. And I think we as a group need to push back on these sensationalized types of headlines that we see. And in my space, it is the loudest and often the most aggressive of the activists that you see, and a couple of them are my relations, and they do the Invasion Day stuff, but they do get messages across in a way that otherwise wouldn't be heard. But I think it's about how do we get that balance right. So yeah, I don't know.
Just very quickly, I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is the influence of social media. And I know this will be on everyone's mind, I'm sure, almost a bit surprised at something like that. But remember, online, all information looks equal. It all looks the same. There's no real easy way of distinguishing between good stuff and bad stuff. There's plenty of imposter content out there which pretends to be the BBC or the New York Times, which is completely fabricated. The issue that we need to figure out, I think there is a corrective underway at the moment. Politicians, through the News Media Bargaining Code, have come up with a system which is designed to try and direct money back into news organisations, so that we have a source of income that is not sensitive to clicks, that isn't forced to create the kind of headlines that competes with a lot of social media clickbait. I think that the News Media Bargaining Code is a flawed solution, but it is an acknowledgement by government that the problem of the system is broken and needs fixing. I do not know of a single journalist who actually likes working in that kind of situation where they're forced to produce that kind of content. But the economics of the business at the moment make it very difficult to do otherwise. I I think we're seeing a realignment of politics and the regulatory environment to try and support good journalism. Certainly the conversations that I'm having with politicians in Canberra suggest that they recognise that. And I am actually reasonably optimistic that we are seeing the kinds of conversations develop. We're right at the very beginning of this process, but I think if we were to be too pessimistic, if we left you walked out of here being completely pessimistic about the legal environment, that would be a mistake. Because I do see there are, Sean, is talking, being very critical of his colleagues, but Sean is also one of the good guys who's putting a lot of effort in. I know as a journalist just how hard I and my colleagues work to get stuff right. There were times when we really had to fight our editors to do that. But good journalists also stand on their integrity, and there will always be those examples of cock-ups and outrageously bad headlines and screw-ups, particularly when it comes to political reporting. But it really isn't all bad. There are just deep systemic and structural problems that we need to address and we are starting to address.
So my question kind of stems off that, because I think Myra brought up the point that, in the recent reporting, we're seeing a strengths-based approach to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing come through. But as journalists, how do you become the good guy and check the implicit bias about the algorithm that's already been built within Australia that has a dominant norm?
Part of the response to that draws on something we've said before. You can't do it in isolation. Newsrooms now have analytics that tell them what stories are particularly popular. And I spent probably 2 years at the Oz every morning going through the analytics, trying to work out patterns and threads. And some days it was just depressing, where you put a lot of effort into an article that has big ramifications and 30 people read it. And unfortunately, a lot of sort of internal policies are driven by that. These are the sort of algorithms, these are the sort of the digital giants created that. Newsrooms respond to that, I think, because they're trying to work out what readers want. They're trying to serve their readers. I can tell you, if a storm is coming in Queensland, we'll write about it because it goes off. Of an afternoon, we'll put it out there, it'll get thousands of hits because people love a good storm coming to Brisbane. Again, you could spend days on an article and we won't get as much as a storm. If I was a weather writer, it would be much easier. But it comes down to, I think there needs to be a little, there've been other sort of transformations in digital disruption that put the power with the consumer. I think the power is with the consumer in the media. But I think people, yeah, and I think people need to, if you're serious about a particular kind of news, unfortunately you need to show it. You need to subscribe, you need to click on those articles. Every time I, by the nature of my job, have to click on a particular Courier Mail article just to see what it's about, I cringe because I know that gives one click that tells them that this is a good way to do journalism, and that reinforces it. I know the ABC had a wonderful example of this where there was a purple grapefruit, and I read that story. Someone found a purple grapefruit, and it was fascinating. And some stories you can't replicate, but the call went out in the newsroom for any other unusual fruits that they could write about, because the algorithms and the data was telling them purple grapefruit is the future of journalism. So, you can't always get it right, but I think consumers have the power through these algorithms and through the analytics that newsrooms are looking at to click on a story that you have faith in, or go to an outlet or a newspaper or a website that you have faith in, or a journalist you have faith in, and click. I don't know that it'll fix things, but that uses the system and the problems we've got and can try and transform it a little.
You probably have time only for one quick question. time.
Oh.
And that's involved all the time. What's first?
Mine is a very quick question. Thank you very much to all the speakers for your talks. Peter, your final comment about the problem with using the war on COVID rhetoric, I was wondering what might be a more constructive alternative. Yeah.
We see it as a medical problem. I mean, you know, I think it's hard for me because I honestly haven't thought as deeply about medical issues as I have about the war on terror. The war on terror, I mean, if I can talk about the war on terror, because I think this is, to me, this has been something that's really exercised my mind. We've thought about, when we went through the war on terror, what it did was that it locked us into a military mindset. But the tools that you need to fight this war on terror are by necessity, by definition, military tools. We were mobilized. What we did was that we securitized the problem, turned it into a war on as a friend of mine described, a war on an abstract noun, a war that is unwinnable. But if you think about the war on terror, if you think about it alternatively, and again, let me go back, it means that you have to fight the war with guns, with soldiers, with special forces, with invasions and so on. We end up in, I think, the classic civilizations, because you wage war on the entire people, in this case, an entire ideology. If we treated the war on terror or the 9/11 rather as a crime, as an act of mass murder, think about how differently that would have changed the way that we dealt with it. That wouldn't have excluded the possibility of using soldiers to go after the bad guys, but it meant that you would have picked out the individuals who were responsible for that particular act of murder rather than waging war on an entire community, which is the way it unfolded. Now, I think when we talk about the war on COVID, what we do is we create a security problem. It means that our government and our agencies see it as a security issue, and they grant themselves more powers around security, around the flow of information. They censor more. They weaponize the solutions. Rather than, I think it was the Danish Prime Minister who described COVID as an unwanted guest at the house, which minimizes the idea of fear. That means that we have to be collaborative rather than confrontational in the way that we deal with this. And you guys, most of the people in this room are medical experts, and you have a much better understanding of how a change of thought thinking might influence the way in which we tackle the problem. I am not convinced, though, that the rhetoric of war is the best way of doing it because of the powers that it grants our politicians, the way it creates an enemy, not necessarily an unseen enemy of the germ, but often an enemy of the people. We've seen Asian people attacked, blamed for this, for the virus. It becomes, I think, a really inappropriate way of dealing with essentially what is a medical problem that requires medical solutions and a collaborative and cooperative approach.
Does it need an analogy at all? Why not call it a pandemic? Because it
Well,
is a pandemic.
and yeah, exactly. A pandemic, because that's what it is. It's not a war.
I think the other example of the war rhetoric was, of course, the Courier Mail's headline, Enemies of the State, when a couple of girls went to Melbourne and came back and broke some rules, and that idea that it's, you must comply, the power, there's a lot of work done in health communication, science communication, even behavioural economics, and how to get people to do what you want them to do in the least expensive way. I think that clashes with politics, and sometimes it clashes with headline writers too.
Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but one of the greatest essays in the English language, George Orwell, wrote a famous essay called The Politics of the English Language, and this was after the Second World War. And what he did was spoke about the way in which this kind of language influences political thought of an entire community. Once we get into that particular discourse, it is very difficult for us to escape those kind of guardrails that discourse provides. That even though no politician is going to talk about war on COVID as if it literally means bringing in guns to fight it, but that language is very helpful for politicians and for gaining political power, even if it isn't helpful in solving the crisis. That language is loaded, and what journalists do is, what we fail to do in both wars, the war on terror and the war on COVID, is to really interrogate that language and the impact of that language. And I think that's a real problem.
So, any last points? I just wanted to say that, Marie, you made a great point where we were having drinks earlier about, what we need is more discourse around humanity and care and concern and compassion. I just wondered if you would like to have the last word.
Sure.
Because I thought that was a really powerful message.
Well, it's true. It's how we need to move forward. I guess just going back to Peter's comments around war, and I was reading an article where it stated that in the United States there's been all but 7 years when that country hasn't been at war with somebody. And that blew my mind. And then when I think about the discourse in this country, and I take it back to that intervention, that was a war on Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, and it was the police and the army that went in to, regain control. So I think that we need to think about the narrative that we're putting out in this country. But yeah, that cliche, be kind, but is it that difficult just to be kind and to have a humanitarian ideal over the way that we treat each other? We're here for a short time, and so we might as well kind of, be nice to each other. It's very soft and fluffy, that's me, but I think it's, at the end of the day, that's what this is really all about, isn't it?
Thank you so much. Wonderful.